The galaxy is vast, so vast that even the brightest of human minds cannot truly comprehend its scope. It stretches outward in all directions, a black ocean without end, speckled with countless suns burning like distant candles in a void too immense for comfort. These stars burn silently, their light traveling across aeons, reaching worlds that have already fallen into ruin by the time their radiance arrives. And in this endless sea of stars, humanity has made its mark, not as a conqueror triumphant, not as a master of destiny, but as a fragile flame clinging to survival. For there is no peace among these endless constellations. There is only war, the Imperium of man, a name spoken with reverence and fear. It spans across 1,000,000 worlds, each one tethered by devotion and by blood, bound together under the shadow of the Golden Throne. Worlds of ice and fire, desert and ruin, hive cities and shattered moons, all claimed in the name of the Emperor, who has sat immobile for 10,000 years. His light burns still, guiding ships across the warp, but it is not the light of warmth or mercy. It is the light of survival, of duty, of sacrifice. And yet, in the stillness of night, even within this vast empire of war, there are places of quiet, places where one might almost believe in peace. Imagine a fortress monastery, carved into the black stone of a mountain peak. Its walls stretch high above the clouds, their surfaces weathered by storms that have raged for millennia. Lightning plays across its towers like celestial fire, yet the structure endures, unyielding, its silhouette etched against the stormy sky like the bones of some great titan. Inside these walls, silence reigns. The monastery is a place of both worship and war. Its cloisters are long and empty, lined with statues of warriors long dead. Their stone faces, expressionless and proud, stand watch over the corridors with eternal vigilance. At first glance, they are but works of art, tributes to fallen heroes, guardians of memory. But in the dim light of the flickering lumen globes, the shadows they cast seem to move, as if the carved eyes are not stone at all, but alive, following every step that dares pass beneath their gaze. Footsteps echo softly against marble floors, slow, measured. The sound does not belong to any ordinary man. Each step is too heavy, too deliberate, too resonant. The stone beneath seems to groan faintly with the weight. Somewhere deep within the monastery, a space marine walks the halls. His armor hums with dormant power, the servos of his warplate sighing softly as he moves. He is a sentinel in the night, a warrior bred for battle, yet here he walks as though he is alone in a world carved from shadow. The halls whisper with memory. Behind every door, reliquaries hum faintly with the charge of ancient machines. Prayer candles flicker in chapels where incense burns low. The scent of oils, sacred, bitter, metallic, lingers in the air, clinging to stone like a memory that refuses to die. Somewhere deeper still, beyond walls of adamantium, the sarcophagi of the fallen rest in silence, their occupants asleep, or perhaps only dreaming. And in the stillness, one hears other things. The faint hum of life support systems, pulsing like a heartbeat. The groan of ancient pipes shifting under the strain of centuries. The crackle of distant vox relays, whispering liturgies in voices too soft to be human. Even the monastery breathes, as though it too is alive, bound to the warriors who inhabit its walls. Above the great hall hangs a banner older than any living soul upon the world. Its cloth is torn, yet it still bears the sigil of the chapter in proud defiance of time. Below it, relics glimmer faintly in the candlelight. Holy bolters used in wars long forgotten, blades etched with prayers in high Gothic, fragments of armor once worn by heroes. Their steel is cold to the touch, yet the faithful whisper that warmth lingers in them still, the last echo of the warriors who bore them into battle. And yet, even in this shrine of reverence, something unsettles the silence. Look too long at the statues, and their shadows seem to stretch unnaturally, fingers clawing against the walls. Stand in the chapel alone, and the flicker of the candles feels too deliberate, as though the flame leans toward you. Pass by the reliquary, and you may feel the faintest shiver, as though the cold steel has drawn some hidden warmth from your very flesh. It is nothing, one tells oneself. A trick of the light, a draught in the ancient halls, the echoes of machinery too old to be trusted, and yet the unease lingers. The air is too still, too heavy, as though the monastery itself is holding its breath. And above all, there is the silence. Not peace, never peace, but the silence of watchfulness, as though in every corner, behind every door, something waits. They are not born as you or I understand birth. They are engendered in a ritual of iron and scripture, coaxed from the marrow of men and machines alike. Speak their origins softly, as if in a chapel there is holiness there and there is coldness. Both demand the same thing: obedience. The process begins long before any blades are drawn. It begins with a call, a census, a number read beneath harsh lights in a world of soot. Boys and young men are sifted from the millions of lives clinging to hive spires and forgotten villages. Some answer with hope, some with the dull gratitude of escape, others with defiance on their tongues. No matter the cause, they step forward beneath the scrutiny of a machine that watches in the dark. A servo-cranial, a recruitment panel, an apothecary's ledger. A name is taken down, and in the taking, there is already a small death. Names belong to families. Here, they will belong to chapters, and chapters are their own gods. The first steps are gentle in appearance, precise in ritual. They mark the transformation with ceremony, because ceremony binds men to fate. In a cold antechamber, the acolytes are washed. Cloths crisp as paper are folded with the same care as relics. Warm water, scented with bitter herbs and a faint chemical tang, runs over skin that has yet to carry armor's weight. The scent of incense, sharp and resinous, hangs in the air, threaded with the metallic aftertaste of cleaning acids. Priests murmur litanies in high Gothic, syllables that feel like math and prayer braided together. The words are not meant to comfort, they are meant to code the soul. Beneath the chapel, beneath the courtyards where training echoes like distant storms, the real work begins. This is where the apothecaries wait. Silent figures in oil-stained robes, faces shadowed by visors that smear reflections into alien designs. Their instruments gleam, clamps that bite with surgical precision, vials that hold the viscous gold of gene seed, clamps of cold ceramic that snap around bone. They move with a calm that could be called tenderness if the act were not so final. Each motion is practiced, a choreography of hands that have performed the same rites for centuries. The room smells of ozone, formaldehyde, and the thin sweetness of human blood. Gene seed is the heart of their making. It is not merely tissue, it is inheritance in crystalline form, a map of change carried from father to brother to chapter. From these minuscule organs, striped, folded, miraculous, the new aspirant will inherit limbs of capability he never knew his body could hold, temperaments altered in the splicer's quiet alchemy. To speak of gene seed is to speak of debt and debtors. So much is given, so much is balanced by what is taken. The implants are delicate and brutal, requiring hands both steady and unflinching. Each capsule slides into place like a whispered promise. The surgeries are neither swift nor showy. They are long rites, repeated under lamplight. Incisions map the survivor's skin like cartography. Tissues are rearranged and coaxed into new function. Organs are grafted and altered. Carapace plates anchor to ribs with pins of alloy. Muscle fibers are teased to accept new load-bearing implants. A brain is nudged with microstimulants until synaptic pathways reroute and accept the orders they were designed to follow. The humming of machinery underpins the whole endeavor, arrays of microstabilizers, the low thrum of a biostasis field, the rhythmic tick of instruments calibrating. The sound is not unlike a meditation bell, constant, unavoidable, grounding. Pain does not feature here in the way the uninitiated might imagine. Where pain exists, it is catalogued and regulated. Sedatives are precise, stimulants are surgical. The mind is soothed in layers, numbings within numbings, and yet, somewhere between each measured injection and the slow, methodical alteration of marrow, a man feels himself unpeeling. He feels tendon give to steel, memory soften beneath new pathways. Names become thinner, the syllables of childhood receding as riggings and oaths take root. Fathers' voices are folded away into liturgies. The past is not denied so much as archived. Ritual follows procedure as hymn follows prayer. Each new graft is blessed by the chapter's chaplain. Oils, blackened with age and inscribed with tiny runes, are applied to sockets and seams. The scent is both medicinal and devotional, a reminder that flesh and spirit are being altered by hands that are both clinical and sacred. Candles shiver in alcoves. Their smoke stitches the sterile air with lines of grey. The chanting is low, in cadences meant to steady heartbeat and glandular tremor, to drown out the panic that might bubble like a spring. The chants name things. The emperor, the chapter, the rite. They do not always use words that the patient understands, but the rhythm seeps in, the repetition shaping a mind like a potter shapes clay. Eyes change their witness. What once recorded playgrounds and markets now logs tactical patterns. The angle of light on a horizon, the way enemy armaments hum. Vision is not merely sharpened, it is retrained. Peripheral awareness becomes a map of potential threats. A neophyte learns to feel the difference between a footstep shifted by terrain and a footstep shifted by intent. Muscles are taught to tense half a breath earlier than reflex requires. A man comes to sleep standing because his body is being prepared to never need the leisure of dreams. Sleep, when it comes, is a stranger. Where dreams once offered the texture of home, an old woman opening a window, the smell of soup, the new mind yields up other images, formations, angles of fire, words in strange tongues. The subconscious becomes a training ground. Nightmares are rehearsals rather than accidents. Over years, the mind learns to catalogue these dreams, folding them away into archives the apothecaries can read and reinterpret. Memory is a resource to be processed and allocated. The boy who remembered the sound of his mother's laugh will find that memory distilled, a single chord beneath a litany, a recurring cadence that surfaces like a ghost only during the longest meditations. To become a space marine is to exchange the private self for a mediated one. Names are the most visible casualties of this exchange. A recruit's name, given in the noisy, tender privacy of a family, comes to be used by fewer and fewer people. It is replaced by ranks and titles, numbers and call signs. Even the naming that remains takes the form of lineage. Brother Sergeant, initiate of the second cohort, brother of the Iron Hand. The language of family gives way to the language of the brotherhood, and in that brotherhood there is solace, a shared identity that cradles the loss of individuality. There, for a time, the sacrifice feels sacred. Here, a man finds belonging in formality, a relief in unity. But solace hardens into something colder with time. Where unity once felt like shelter, it becomes an enclosure. The rituals that comfort become the furnace that tempers. Devotion is first a balm. It calms the fears that linger in a new chest. It gives structure to bodies that would otherwise be overwhelmed by their own new capacities. The chanting and the oil, the iconography and the daily inspections, these are scaffolding. They teach a man his place and how to occupy it without thought. There is dignity in the predictability. There is power in obedience. Yet zealotry is a patient thing. It grows like lichen, slow and inevitable. What begins as care becomes expectation. Where once a man prayed to steady his hand, he now prays because not praying would be an error in function. The liturgies shift from tools of solace to directives of identity. They are no longer just songs. They are compilers that rewrite thought into service. Praise becomes command. Devotion that was chosen becomes a reflex, then a need. Where prayer once soothed fear, it now feeds it. Without liturgy, the mind frays. Without the chapter's cadence, the synaptic scaffolds would collapse. Brothers are reminded daily that they are the Emperor's instrument, just as an arm is reminded of its purpose. The pathology of devotion creeps subtly into everyday things. A smile becomes an anomaly to be catalogued and understood before it can be replicated. Humor, once spontaneous, is now an observation. What makes the others laugh, and how does it change cohesion? Grief is metabolized into ritual, victories into lists. Personal preference is a risk. Choosing one path over another suggests separateness, and separateness is the floor from which heresy grows. Individuality is watched for, noted, corrected. This is not merely a loss of self. It is the manufacture of a new organism that uses the category of self differently. The Space Marine's identity becomes distributed. Where a civilian experiences continuity centered on the individual, my childhood, my home, my name, the Marine experiences continuity across the Brotherhood and across time. He is a node. His memory threads into the chapter's memory. His pain is shared, his valor recorded, his failures seamed into the chapter's ledger. The effect is a kind of immortality that is not kind. The man is preserved across deeds rather than days. Sensory detail marks the change like a liturgy marks a season. The scent of incense lingers as an overlay to all other smells, a cognitive anchor. When a brother smells it, his brain triggers a cascade. Calm, readiness, recitation. The drip of sacred oils, applied to stumps, seams, mechanical joints, becomes a small worship that links flesh to metal. The oils are viscous, warmed before application. They smell faintly of iron and citrus, a paradox of antiseptic and ritual. They slide into places between plate and skin and are absorbed with a sound like a breath. The crackle of machinery is another hymn. In the workshop, the servos make a sound like a distant thunderstorm. The respirators hiss a sibilant accompaniment to prayer. These are not noises that can be ignored. They are the audio scaffolding of new identity. Within the chest, the augmentation is not only physical. There are implants that speak to the nervous system in ways the surgeon's words do not. Interfaces hum with a frequency that feels like an answer when the chapter provides a command. There are vox implants that let a brother carry a litany like a second voice in his skull, a private psalm he can summon at will. There are neural bands that dampen pain or accentuate the sound of a commander's tone, making orders bloom like lights in the dark. These are gifts and shackles in equal measure. They make a man faster, harder, closer to effortless slaughter, and they make him less his own. It is here, in the quiet intersections of machine and memory, that the inner struggle takes root. The mind resists and rewrites itself in small measures. A neophyte might, in a rare moment of stillness, recall his mother's hands shaping bread at dawn. The image is so intimate it aches. Flour under fingernails, steam rising from a loaf, the creak of a wooden door. He clings, savoring the warmth, and for a breath he is again a son. Then the rhythm of the chapel reasserts itself, the low hum of the chapel's bell, the measured scraping of a sergeant's boot, and the scene blurs. The mother's hands become an echo beneath armor, like a memory routed through an old, misunderstood machine. These recollections do not disappear so much as they are translated. The mother's hands are catalogued, tagged, and archived. They surface in rituals as metaphor, a simile for care when bonding a new brother, an image to explain a procedure. The neophyte learns to accept the translation because it is safer. Memory, reframed, becomes a tool for cohesion. But when memory is a tool, it can be wielded at will by those with the rituals. The brother who cannot recall his childhood is an easy instrument. The brother who clings to memory is a risk, and there is always the spectre of doubt. It arrives in small, well-managed ways. A hesitation before a prayer, a dream that refuses to be catalogued. Doubt is whispered and immediately responded to with ritual. A chaplain's counsel, a round of extra cycles in the cognitive baths, a public confession. These are cures rehearsed for generations. The chapter knows how to excise doubt. It punishes the contagion of thought that would fracture the unity necessary for war. So the transformation is both physical and moral, an economy of exchange, marrow and memory for machinery and mission. What is gained is stupendous. Strength beyond a man's natural measure, endurance that survives wounds mortal to civilians, a lifespan extended by procedure and ceremony. What is lost is perhaps less definable. The private jokes, the names of childhood friends, the particular cadence of a mother's voice. These losses are not always mourned openly. They are catalogued as necessary. They are, in turn, the raw material of the chapter's myth. In quiet moments, when the machines cool and the liturgies are spent, the new brother can sometimes feel the edges of both lives, the throb of the servo motor under the skin, and the faint ache of a memory, like a ghost hand on his shoulder. He has been refashioned into a weapon. He has been anointed into a priest. He walks between those identities without always knowing which one holds him. The world outside will call him monstrosity or savior, depending on which of his faces it meets. Inside the monastery, they teach him to wear both with equal grace. This is their nature, forged in iron and prayer, rewired and renamed, beloved and feared. They are the Imperium's blade and its seamstress, its shield and its archivist. The creation of a space marine is an act of faith performed with scalpels. It promises salvation for the species and demands the surrender of the person. To tell it calmly, clinically, is not to be cruel. It is merely to acknowledge the price, and to those who pay it, to those who are remade by it. The cost is a small thing compared to the clarity of purpose it grants. To stand where others fall, to bear what others cannot, to be the hand that shapes destiny, even as it is shaped by hands older than memory. There are those who will say such a bargain is monstrous. There are those who will call it holy. The monastery keeps both verdicts beyond its walls. Within, there is only the steady work of remaking, the measured breathing of machines, and the soft, ceaseless litany that reminds the newly forged, you are less alone now. You belong to the chapter, and for many, that belonging is enough. They arrived on the world like a promise revised, The dropships bled through a sky that had once been black with stars and now smudged with ash, their descent a long and careful sigh. The planet was dead by any standard that mattered. No verdant coasts, no bustling cities with light pinned like stars along riverbeds. Only long plains of glassed stone and ruined spires, the skeletons of cities that had been unmade by time or war. Even the wind here had a kind of patience, a slow, deliberate exhale that carried grit and the smell of ozone. Ash fell like snow and softened every outline until even distance seemed to fold back into itself. The chapter had known worlds like this. They were called to them with a protocol that seldom left room for wonder. Reconnaissance, purge, secure. The patrol that left the drop points on thin gunmetal feet moved with the calm efficiency of a mechanism that had learned to trust rhythm over hesitation. Their armor made the first sound, a low metallic groan as servos adjusted to the strain of walking across ash-slick stone. The groan was almost musical at first, a bass note beneath the wind, a private hymn. But when you listened closer, when you let the sound live in your ears long enough, it felt like an apparatus clearing its throat before it spoke. They walked in a formation that had been rehearsed and annotated in countless manuals and etched into muscle memory by drills that lasted longer than many men's lives. There were 6 in the front line. The sergeant with the squared shoulders and a helm scarred from battles whose names no living man remembered. The flamer gunner, its weapon a sleeping beast across his arm. A scout with lenses glinting like tiny moons. 2 brothers whose armor still held the dull sheen of recent polish. And the youngest, a novice whose steps were both the lightest and the loudest, because they carried a newness the others had learned to hide. The landscape around them refused to acknowledge their intrusion with drama. Ruined towers punctured the horizon like the broken teeth of some ancient colossus. Pools of black water lay like eyes in depressions, reflecting the pallid sky. The wind moved through the ruins and made a hollow voice that could be mistaken for distant prayers, or the keening of something alive and unseen. The ash settled on pauldrons and banners alike, dulling emblems until they could be read only by those who already knew the scriptures. For a while, the monotony was a kind of mercy. Nothing sudden happened. Nothing flared or exploded. Nothing rushed them from the darkness of a collapsed archway, and yet the quiet had a texture that made the men uneasy. It was not just the absence of life, but the presence of a certain attention. The planet listened. The wind whispered as it passed through the ruins' bones, and sometimes the whispers folded into patterns too deliberate to be merely meteorological. When the Vox relay crackled to life in one brother's helmet, the noise was thin and metallic, but threaded through with something else. Static, it sounded like syllables, a voice that seemed to try on words before giving up and falling back into hiss. It was a faint thing, barely audible if you were not trained to catch the nuance, but training in this place had a way of making small things enormous. The first sign that something was wrong came not from the world, but from within the armor. The youngest of their number reached up and pressed his gauntleted fingers to the side of his helm. His hand came away dusted with ash, and with a tremor that had nothing to do with the cold. He tapped the Vox panel and checked the readouts, his suit's HUD presenting neat, organized icons. Respirator pressure, servo load, neural latency. All green, no warning flags. Yet a small blue light pulsed inside the Vox sender like a heartbeat that would not remain still. The sergeant glanced at him and said nothing. The habit of silence had been ingrained by more than etiquette. They moved through a plaza where a fountain had once been, its basin now a shallow, cracked crook of stone. The scout paused at the edge and drew a breath that did not belong to any living lung. The helmet whispered like a closed shell, sucking in the thin air. He knelt and touched the water with a gloved finger, as one might touch a relic, lightly, with the reverence taught in the monastery. The surface rippled, but ripples were not the most astonishing thing. Under the water lay things that had not existed before the dropships arrived. Small, angular shards of glass that bore scratches like letters. For a moment, every man saw the same pattern and felt the same tick of recognition, as if a memory had brushed past his skull. The scout's vision flickered. He blinked in the way a machine blinks when it resets, deliberate, mechanical. Then he looked away and continued. Memory behaved oddly on this world. It surfaced in little islands and then retreated, leaving the men clutching the airy bits of recollection like talismans. A brother would remember a laugh, a private human sound. Then the image would collapse under the weight of drills and the harsh, bright words of the litany that lived in their throats. A smell would seize someone briefly, a woman's soap, the smoke of burning bread, and then the smell would disintegrate into the odor of machine oil. Such flashes were always brief and always misaligned. They arrived fragmented, like messages transmitted across a damaged relay. A single word repeated in a loop, a face seen out of the corner of an eye, a childhood song that sounded wrong in the throat because it no longer belonged to a place the soldier could return to. There were moments when the vox seemed to answer. The static, when it rose, shaped words that clung to the bones of the sentences they might have been. The brothers learned to call them prompts, ambient interference that could, by some unpredictable grace, contain syllables that pushed just beyond comprehension. Listen. A hiss might begin, and then the word would break apart as if someone had pressed a thumb to the speaker. It was easier to label these anomalies as interference from the warp, or residual signals from long-dead transmissions. It was more difficult to confess that sometimes the words felt like names. Names, once spoken, have a habit of seeking ears. The helmets changed the way they remembered. Under the plates, thoughts were digitized and reframed. The internal HUD would overlay tactical data onto what the eye saw, and sometimes the overlay malfunctioned. Instead of a danger symbol, there would be a brief flash of what? A kitchen table, perhaps, or a child's hand. In one instance, the sensor grid stuttered and threw up an image of a garden gate. The brother saw it for a heartbeat. White wood, a rusted latch. For an even briefer second, the man tasted salt. Not sweat, not the ash in his mouth, but salt as if from a face crying on a pillow. He swallowed, and the taste slid away. For the rest of the march, his jaw worked like a man with hay in his teeth. The pattern revealed itself in the mechanical appendages as much as in the mind. Bioaugments did not always behave as their schematics promised. Nerve fibers misfired beneath synthetic skin, and small, involuntary spasms began to ripple across elbows and necks. One brother's bicep would twitch twice, sharp and abrupt, then flatten as though a valve had closed. In another, a spine-mounted actuator clogged and released like a coughing engine. The sergeant checked each man with cold, blinking efficiency. Interface ports were sealed, valves cycled, biogels topped up. Everything nominal, yet the twitch persisted. Tiny betrayals in an otherwise relentless cohesion. They were the kind of fault that could be rationalized away in a log entry as micro-neuro discrepancies. But each small failure felt to the men like an exposure, a breach of the covenant that bound flesh to forge. Helmets grew heavy as the sky lengthened. It was partly mental and partly physical. The seals under the chin had been tightened in anticipation of noxious atmospherics, and the constant hiss of filtered air became a private metronome, beating in time with the march. To the unarmored eye, the brothers moved as if in grace, but within those helmets, constraints pressed upon breath and memory alike. Some of them, walking in absolute silence, would take a hand to their jawline, to the seam where the helm met the neck, and press just so. The action looked like adjustment, but was often the attempt to suppress something worse. A sensation of suffocation that had nothing to do with oxygen levels. It was a pressure that came from the inside out, the awareness of being contained within metal and liturgy, the slow realization that the self was no longer entirely contained in human tissue. At midday, if one could call it that, on a world where the sky was always the color of old bone, the patrol crossed a thoroughfare where the remains of banners once snapped in true wind. Here the architecture had formed a kind of echo chamber. The ruined facades pressed inward, and the wind had to find a singular corridor. When the brothers walked through, the wind played on them like a chorded instrument, and in that chord, the vox static grew into pattern. It was no longer merely syllables and dead noise. It arranged itself into something that looked like conversation. The sergeant thought at first it might be a trick of reverberation, a chance alignment of sounds, but the voice was too intimate for that. It sounded like a whispering that had been recorded on a loop. Brother, remember. No one admitted to hearing it at once. Admissions were a hazardous currency. In the monastery, confessions were ritualized, and to reveal doubt in the field could invite unnecessary scrutiny. So they walked on, and the words threaded their way beneath helmets, and each man carried the small, increasing ache of the suggestion that memory could be summoned by outside things. The youngest of them swallowed and tasted something like blood for a second, and his HUD noted the uptick. The sergeant recorded it in a private quarter of his mind. Night crept in without ceremony. The ashfall thickened into something almost tactile, a blanket spread across the world that muffled step and sound. They made a hollow where they could, between the broken ribs of a cathedral-like ruin, and set up a minimal perimeter. Servos played quiet songs as power couplings idled down. The youngest, shivering in a way that seemed to come from the soul rather than the body, lit a single, sanctioned light. It was a small amber globe that cast a halo of acceptable warmth. Shadows at the edges of the circle lengthened, as if trying to step into the glow, and were always just shy of being real. They ate mechanically. Rations were compressed into neat bars, tasted like everything that was not home. Conversations, when they came, were clipped and full of the equipment of war. Checks on ammo, arrows of reconnaissance. When personal things were mentioned, it was with the polite distance of colleagues. "Where did you hail from?" one brother asked. Not because he did not know, but because ritual suggested a civility. The answer came as a list of coordinates, worlds, production codes. There were no stories. Stories were a luxury for those not sharpened by steel. And yet, in the hollow between the beat of servos and the whisper of litany, the world delivered another small fracture. Vox static that had once been background noise unspooled into a sound like someone breathing close to the ear. An old, intimate sound. The youngest flinched as if to a hand on his shoulder. He turned his head toward the place where the noise seemed to originate and saw nothing but the empty archway. He tried to rationalize. He told himself that the mind played games in quiet places. It rewired images into comfort or horror, depending on what survived. He forced the thought to the edge of attention and then drove it away with a prayer. The prayer came not from his mouth, but from an implant. A quiet, surgically implanted litany that whispered the cadence of the chapter's blessing. It soothed, and for a while it worked. The dreams, however, were not easily soothed. When at last they slept, standing in a circle, helmets off but still within reach of plate, sleep brought no rest. Dreams here were thin and violent, not the warm, humid images of law that sometimes visited recruits. They were rehearsals of impossible things. Corridors with doors that led to other corridors in impossible angles. Faces that fragmented into machinery, with pupils that became screws. The sound of a mother's voice receding down a long iron hallway until it was indistinguishable from the echo of a servo. Some of these images remained upon waking like a thin film, as if the mind had been dipped in oil and retrieved. It was the pattern of small, accumulating aberrations that made a man begin to doubt. Not a single catastrophe, not a single moment of absolute horror. Those things made sense and were easily catalogued. Rather, it was the slow accumulation of mismatched pieces, a voice where no voice should be, a twitch of a synthetic muscle, a flash of a childhood table when only the senses should record rubble. Each item alone could be explained away. Together they made a narrative that refused tidy classification. By the patrol's third day, the anomalies had grown bold. In one ruined hall, a statue's shadow did not align with any single light source. The brothers stopped and watched, and for each of them the shadow seemed to slither when they looked away and then become noble again when they returned their gaze. The scout reported a persistent ping in his ocular array that corresponded to nothing physical, a frequency that aligned with ancient memorials on no record. The service log registered it as an environmental artifact, and the sergeant logged the notation with the same flatness he applied to battle damage. Yet the men felt the subtle pressure of it like a hand on the back of the neck. Attention, watching, waiting. Bio-augmentation failures increased in frequency. A brother's ocular implants flickered and for a breath pulled up a ghost overlay. The pattern of veins in a small, soft hand. Nothing like the hardened grips of weapons or the scarred palms of veterans. The implant reset, and the hand was erased and replaced by a tactical overlay. The man brought his thumb to the seam of the implant and pressed until the pain came back like a proof of being. Pain was a test, a sign that the biological substrate still had claim. Pain meant you were not wholly an instrument yet. Conversations about these occurrences were not conversations so much as observances. They used the language of command, catalogued with a numb procedural rhythm. Noise in Vox channel, the scout would say. Micro twitch at elbow, the medic would note. Each report was a small incantation of normalcy designed to stave off the larger admission that something about their construction allowed for leakages, for memories to shimmer through the armor, like heat through metal. It was easier to measure than to name. And then, in the center of a ruined amphitheater, they found a child-sized shoe. It lay alone on a cracked step, blackened by ash, its laces nibbled by time. For a moment, none of them moved. The sergeant knelt and ran gloved fingers along the seam. His HUD recorded no useful data, no DNA signatures, no warm residuals, nothing that would trigger the usual protocols. The shoe was, in all material senses, a relic, but flinches do not require evidence. The brothers felt it anyway. A pang like a dropped coin inside a belly, unexpectedly heavy. In the helmet of the youngest, a flicker, an image of a hand covered in flower-shaping bread, the same memory that had flashed and been shoved back into the archive. His throat tightened, and for a second the litany in his implants stuttered. He swallowed, and the sound in his ears snapped back to the hum of the respirator. What could be explained was catalogued. What could not be recorded was kept private. The sergeant placed the shoe into a sealed sack and recorded the find with a terse notation. He closed the bag like a sacred box. It was method. It was protection. It was an attempt to make something that felt wrong into something administrable. That night, the wind carried voices more clearly than before. They were not simply artifacts on the Vox, but threads that moved between men, seeping into the seams of helmets and settling around nerve endings. In the circular light of their encampment, the brothers listened as the wind played them like strings. It offered names in late syllables. It offered half lines of song. It offered the smell of laundry line poles and a rain that had never touched this world. At the edge of perception, the youngest heard his mother singing the way she used to, and for the first time since he had become a brother, he felt an old, bitter desire to drop his weapon and run toward a house that had no longer any coordinates on his HUD. He did not run. None of them did. That was not their function. They did not flee. They did not cry. They stood and watched the ash collect in the seams of their armor. When the prayer cycle came, the sergeant called it, and the brothers intoned with voices that were low and precise. Each phrase was a knot that held something undone. The chanting steadied them like ropes, made them whole for a moment. But when the liturgy ended and the last syllable dissolved into the night, their mechanized hearts continued to beat, and the quiet that followed felt like an accusation. In the days that remained of the patrol, the world would offer more small betrayals. A mural in a collapsed quarter would show, under layers of grime, the outline of a mother pressing a child to her chest, a motif familiar enough to seed recognition in every man who viewed it. An old Vox frequency would play back the lullaby at half speed. The tones stretched and warped until they sounded like a chant from a different religion. A servo motor would make a noise that could be parsed into syllables. There were more shoes found, a cracked doll head, footprints leading into corridors that opened into nothing. The question that rose in private minds was not one of tactics, but of ontology. If a man is remade until his memories can be sifted like data, is he still, in any meaningful way, a man? Or is he an assembly, a combination of circuitry and creed, whose dreams are only exercises in procedural memory? They asked it tentatively, in the moments when a man could not quite bring himself to pray. They asked it, not in words, but in the small rebellions that survived. A shared half smile, a stolen joke, the private pressure of a thumb across a scar. Answers did not come, only more questions. The world offered fragments, not solutions. A child's shoe, a half-broken lullaby, an echo that sounded suspiciously like a name. The brothers pulsed with ritual and with steel, their formation unbroken, their duty fulfilled with the efficiency of a machine that remembers what it was made to do. And all the while, beneath that training and under the plate, there was a slow unraveling of certainty. A sense that the instruments meant to keep them whole were the same instruments that made them unknowable to themselves. When the patrol finally exfiltrated, when the dropships rose again like mechanical ghosts, and the ruined planets sank back into the silence of space, something lingered. It was not a tangible thing they could name. It was the residue of attention, the sense that the world had not simply been emptied, but had watched them in return. The ash on their armor carried with it the taste of distant bread and the echo of a small voice they could not quite place. It followed them like a stain. They left with records filed and anomalies noted. The chapter would discuss them with the formal coldness the institution afforded, and the medic would run tests and mark them non-critical. The sergeant would enter the findings into the ledger and recite them in the manner of a man reciting a familiar prayer. In the privacy of their barracks, each brother would run a hand over his face and feel, for a moment, the soft ghost of a memory that did not belong to the war. And as the dropship re-entered the cold womb of the void, the youngest pressed his hand to the seam where the helmet met the throat and felt the small rise and fall of his chest. A human proof under armor. He tasted ash, and for just a second, the ghost sweetness of a woman's bread. Then the ship's engines sang, and the noise swallowed everything. They returned to the monastery with the ash of the dead world still clinging to their armor, as if the planet had given them a gift they could not refuse. At first, the return felt like relief. Familiar corridors, the low, regulated hum of life support, the unquestioning protocol of the apothecaries and the chaplains. The chapter's routines received them like tides receive weathered ships, steady hands on moorings, candles lit in welcome. But some tides carry undertow, and some harbors are formed from something older than safe harboring. In the days that followed, the little disturbances that had been dismissed as environmental artifact hardened into a pattern, and the pattern became an argument between what had been built to protect and what it concealed. The body remembers in ways the mind cannot always translate. Where metal met skin, it hummed with a foreign song, thin and persistent, like insects tuning their wings to a distant thunder. A brother would wake in the middle of the night with a burn that had no explanation on his forearm. When he peeled back the fabric of his sleeve, a hairline fracture cracked across a tendon, and beneath the tear, the glint of metal showed like the edge of a memory. He pressed his gloved hand to it and felt the servos thrum, a low mechanical answer that felt almost like a purr. Where there had once been scars that told the sensible story of battle, now there were seams that spoke of something else, seams that wanted work and feeding and, when left alone, whispered. Gene seed, the miraculous heredity that made them what they were, began to sound like a chorus threaded with hunger. In the quiet sanctum of the apothecary halls, the vials glittered under halo lamps. They were curated with the devotion of relic keepers. They were catalogued, then coded into the chapter's long memory banks. But the brothers who passed the racks could hear a faint susurration if they paused close enough. Not the sterile hum of contained biology, but something like breath. It was a sound low and almost apologetic at first. One thinks of sap rising in a tree. Then, when they listened too long, it became a thrum that suggested appetite. The apothecaries spoke of it in technical tones. Subliminal osseous resonance, micrometabolic upregulation. The chaplains called it a test of faith. The brothers who worked the closest to the gene crypts called it by a name they did not use aloud. Hunger. Augmetics that had once been instruments now felt like appendages with their own insistence. Servos that had been quiet in patrols returned to the monastery complaining with new frequencies. Small gears rasped against housing with the thin sound of gnawed bone. When an armored hand moved, it made a noise the old veterans had never heard. Soft clicks that sounded when heard in certain corridors like speech. One brother, cleaning a bolter in the refectory, felt the hairs along his neck prick as the weapon's recoil buffer sent up a tiny vibration, and the metal in his palm answered with something like a consonant. He thought at first that his mind made the association. When two others on the bench looked up together with the same unease, they realized they had all heard it. Symbols of corruption crept into places that had once been sanctified. They did not arrive all at once as graffiti in screaming colors, but in the patient, subversive way that rot takes root under paint. Purity seals that had been affixed in the heat of liturgical ceremony frayed at the edges, their wax crumbling into the fine dust of centuries. Where once those seals had hung crisp and immaculate, now they trembled like dead wings, loosened by some hand the brothers did not see. Rust mottled the iron of the aquilus carved into archways. The double-headed eagle, emblem of unassailable power, slid in places into something that looked more like a twisting bilaterality, an aquila whose feathers were needles. Brothers woke to find tiny sigils scratched into the underside of their helmets, marks so fine the eye could miss them unless trained to notice the scratch's cadence. The marks did not map to any sanctioned iconography, nor to any enemy sigil the chapter had catalogued. They were older, cleverer. Someone, or something, had learned how to write the spaces between doctrine. There were nights when the monastery's great banners creaked in a wind that did not touch them. It was not a storm wind. It was a draft with purpose, as if the fabric itself were breathing. From a distance, one could see the banners flutter with a melancholic dignity. Up close, the frayed tails of the cloth were encrusted with a black, dry film that would flake away upon touch, revealing underthings that glinted oddly. Tiny, hair-like filaments of metal that had been woven into the fibers without ceremony. When a sergeant peeled back a small section and held it toward a lamp, the threads shimmered with a hint of movement. No more than a suggestion, like the twitch of a sleeping moth. The discovery was logged, sealed, and filed, and the records were titled with the perfunctory neutrality of bureaucracy. They were filed in a ledger whose columns spelled uncertain origin in small, clean script, and the ink on that same page smeared in a way that looked for a moment like a handprint, though no hand had been there. A chapel of silence grew into their lives like mold growing across stone. It began as a place of hush, the smaller of the monastery's oratories, stone-walled and vaulted, rank with incense and dimly applied light. It was designed for reflection, low benches for a few, a stained glass window that had once depicted the emperor as a distant sun, shards of colour that painted the floor like a scattered memory. The first time a brother entered and felt a wrongness, he brushed it aside as fatigue. The second time, it lodged like an ache in the jaw. By the third entry, the ache had become a knowledge. This chapel listened. The chapel's statues were not particularly old by the chapter's scale, but they had been near battlefields where the crude logic of survival had bent everything. They were carved in the likenesses of heroes, pallid faces, idealized armor, fists raised in eternal benediction. In the creeping quiet of twilight, those stone faces seemed to lean into their own chins and watch. One evening, when the brothers processed through in the slow step of a ritual, a small rivulet of rust bled from the mouth of a marble saint and ran down the pedestal in a stripe like a teardrop. The red-brown streak glinted under candlelight, and for a second, every man who saw it felt a coldness like a premonition. In the chapel's hush, the sound of that rust drop made a note like a struck bell. Clean, pure, and impossible to place in a litany. Prayers began to echo back wrong. A novice recited a standard supplication, a litany for protection, a rhythm taught in infancy by the chapter, and his phrase returned slightly altered, as if played from a damaged reciter. "Keeper of steel, gird us," he would say, and from somewhere in the vault the chapel would give back. "Gird us, feed us." The change was ever so small at first. It could be passed off as a quirk in the way stones swallowed syllables and re-emitted them with a slight delay. Yet when a dozen men heard the same misheard line echo back, and when the misheard line occasionally finished with one of those fine, illegible marks scratched upon it, a new kind of fear settled like pollen. A brother removed his gauntlet for the first time in many years in that chapel. It was not planned. He had come to pray because the new noises had set his teeth on edge, because the gene crypts hummed at dawn with a frequency that made him press his palms to his temples. He unclasped and peeled the armoured finger casings back with hands that trembled only because the action felt like a transgression. Beneath the plates, the flesh was not as he remembered. The skin had fine hairline fissures that did not bleed, but glowed faintly at their margins. Within those cracks lay filigreed bands of circuitry, not crude implants but latticework, delicate traces of metal that threaded and looped like spider silk. Nerve tendrils intertwined with microcoils and were sealed in places with resin that had the translucent sheen of amber. The overall effect was less a graft than a metamorphosis. Flesh becoming frame, frame becoming flesh. For a moment the brother saw his own palm as if through someone else's eyes. Curious, clinical, fascinated. When he flexed his fingers, the skeletal underlay responded with a sound like a comb running over glass. The noise resonated in his chest and in the chapel's vaults, and answered back from the plaster in a way that made the hair along his lower arm stand up. A breath came out of him that held the softest of sobs, the kind that is bereavement without the story, and then he clapped the gauntlet back into place, as ceremonially, as if he had been donning the armor for the first time. The act felt like an apology to the metal. He could not have said whether his hands had been the hands of a man or some instrument that had been made in a man's form. In the weeks that followed, he would notice that when he slept, the ghost of that comb-over glass would sound under the skin, like a subroutine that could not be switched off. Voices layered with machinery. Where there had once been only human speech, now there were harmonics. A brother's voice twinned with the thin, synthetic chime of a diagnostic tone, like a choir where some members had forgotten the words and hummed their parts instead. During a drill, the sergeant barked a correction and watched a recruit respond. The recruit's reply came. Then a metallic aftertone filtered through the Vox channel like an echo on a delay line, exactly in time, but digital, a little too clean. Those who trained in close quarters began to watch the recruits' faces for signs, lips twitching not merely in the shape of words, but in how words resonated through implants. Some men began to whisper that the implants were learning to harmonize with something else, an unregistered rhythm that belonged to the monastery's bones. The dreams worsened, as if the day's wrongness needed nocturnal canvas to draw on. The dreamscapes borrowed from the chapel and then bent its geometry. The vaulted ceilings became longer and longer in dream space, until the brothers felt as if they were walking down an eaves of bone. Statues stepped down from their plinths to study the brothers with faces that were exact, and yet grotesquely rearranged. Eyes moved to temple, mouths stitched with faint metal lines. Once in sleep, a brother found himself in the apothecary, but the racks did not hold vials. They held jars of moving, opalescent light that murmured. A stitch would come in his dream limbs, and when the stitching finished, the opalescent light would breathe as one would breathe, and then flatten into an almost palm. Those hands would wave at him, and the voice in the jar would ask, "Why have you forgotten the taste?" Liturgies began to speak back in tongues not taught by the codex. The canon that had been passed down in the chapter for generations had its own cadence, a kind of procedural music shaped to the order of war. Now the cadences diverged. A prayer for the emperor would fall off its expected cadence and slide into intervals that were wrong, too close together or too far, as though some unseen ear were retuning the world. In the medallions and sigils, new phrases appeared, not in High Gothic, but in a script older and more sinuous. The words could not at first be pronounced. They were shapes that made the tongue ache with the attempt. When read aloud by a brother whose voice had not yet been altered, they had the effect of a needle moving across a record, and for a moment, all instruments would stop to listen. Those who listened too long would later find that the taste of iron lingered on their tongues, as if someone had let the taste of warped circuitry touch their lips. Physical corruption arrived in forms that made sense on a battlefield, yet felt obscene in the monastery. Wounds that healed with wrong textures, scars that moved like mimes when no one looked. A brother who had taken shrapnel to the thigh found the wound knit with tiny metallic scales that shifted slightly when he flexed. A small rust bloom spread under his skin, traveling along vessels like a creeping vine. A surgeon removed a shard, only to find that where the foreign metal had been was now a thin, translucent sheath of synthetic tissue bearing a faint pattern, an alphabet of dots arranged in no code he recognized. He catalogued it, wrapped it, set it in a jar. In the nights thereafter, the surgeon dreamt of fields of dots that blinked like insect eyes and heard, far off, the sound of a machine boot stepping down on soft soil. The more they examined, the less explanation seemed possible. Scientific protocols failed in time-hallowed ways. Instruments would read normal and then degrade in accuracy under conditions where they had always been reliable. An autospectral scanner might show a residue of organic proteins on an object, but the proteins had a vibration the machine could not resolve, an irrational harmonic, as if the matter answered not only to chemical laws, but to some other signature. Men who had been trained to ironclad certainty found themselves making notes in margins with language born of superstition. The material resonates, like living bone, one apothecary wrote in an otherwise clean log. He underlined the sentence and put it in a drawer. Rumors run in monasteries like secret contagions. Where one man believes his own eyes, another will call it madness. Where many believe, the belief gains mass and pushes at the walls of the institution. Word reached the chapter's higher council in clipped official memos. Anomalous readings in patrol return. Recommend increased vigil. The council responded with increased procedure. Mandatory checks, additional rites, a new round of mechanical audits. There were more litanies and more monitoring. But ritual is not detergent. It does not always remove stain. It sometimes only covers it with another thin skin. Chaos, the thing the chapter feared and fought for ages, never announced itself with banners and trumpets in their halls. It insinuated logic with the patient patience of rot. A small graffiti of sigils, lines and curves brushed with a hand that knew curvature, appeared in the storage rooms. They were dismissed as prankish by a lieutenant who had once been a boy with hands too idle for heroic acts. He scrubbed them off with clean water and prayers, and the symbol came back the next dawn, traced inside the lid of a supply crate. Someone had ripped the lid to check. Its metal edge bore a scratch that, under magnification, showed the same pattern taken up into the pitting. They began to speak less of what and more of who. If something could touch the fabric of the chapter and mark it, what did it want? The answers were as partial as the evidence. Some said it sought to consume identity, to reduce men into the same instrument. Others believed it sought accession, a merging of flesh and code to a higher order. The older men remembered nightmares of older crusades and the whispers those crusades had left behind. The youngest remembered faces he had once loved, and the way those faces had been rearranged into icons in the dreams. All of them, young and old, felt that the monastery had stopped being simply a place of shelter and had become an organ in a larger body whose functions they could not name. There were moments when the dread became almost a palpable element, a pressure in the air that matched the pressure of weather. In the forge vault, a brother paused as the ring of hammers slowed by a breath. The flames licked with a color like bruised sky. He watched sparks that seemed to hang longer than physics promised, and in that extra time saw them knit into patterns. For a fraction of an instant, the sparks resembled little flittering glyphs, an alphabet of motion that spelled nothing and everything. Then the forge snapped back, and the images were gone. He swallowed, and the taste of the spark lingered in his throat like pepper. The crescendo was not a single, shattering event. It came as a wave that rose, folded, and rose again. Tensions that had been background noise now came to the surface in loud gestures. A brother suffering a seizure of the augmentations mid-training, voice and limb seizing into involuntary patterns, until another brother forced the control switch and shut down the faulty core. In the infirmary, a man bled not blood but a dark, viscous oil that shimmered like storm water. His veins glowed faintly, as if a lattice had become visible beneath skin. In the library, a shelf of annotated doctrine tomes fell as if in mock salutation, opening to a passage that no one remembered writing and that none wanted to read. The passage described, in sterile language, sequences of surgical procedure that would alter marrow into new instruments. Panic was not cinematic in the chapter. It was precise and quiet, an administrative panic that wrote lists and marked crosses. Men were reassigned, records were sealed, and more litanies were added to the prayer cycles. The chaplains increased confessional hours. The apothecaries increased rounds. Yet in the mouths of men, these measures carried the taste of ritual flaying. They did not purge the illness. They simply attuned the community to it. And sometimes, when the lamps in the long wards dimmed to their lowest setting, the chapel's echoes would sing a phrase new to the liturgist's ear. It was not a phrase that spoke of corruption in blunt terms. It spoke instead almost sweetly of home. It asked, with syntax like a lullaby, "Do you remember why you left?" The substance of the question was a blade, a memory with purpose. Those who were called by it felt a tug the way a limb feels tugged when asleep, an odd, prickling warble of wanting. The crescendo swelled until the monastery's polished floors bore the sheen of oil and blood like a mirror. The brothers found themselves waking to the same dream in numbers that made the apothecary priests frown, a corridor with doors whose hinges sang the name of the chapter, as if each hinge were an organ remembering its own name. In the dreams, fingers worked at seams, and the seams opened to reveal small mouths that whispered questions. The mouths asked trivialities, then large things. Who are you? What do you remember? When the brothers woke and rolled their shoulders under the assault of gravity, some could not immediately answer. Identity frayed in the place where metal interfaced with marrow. The false calm that had sotto voce held them began to crumble into something else, an urgency with a patient rhythm. The gene seed hummed, augmentations answered, and symbols of corruption braided themselves into the chapter's life. No one could say for certain whether the change had started in the planet they had cleansed, or whether the monastery had always been a place poised on an edge, and only now finally yielded. The questions multiplied without resolution. All that remained in many men's minds was a simple, terrifying sense that the instruments made to defend humanity might, in the end, be the instruments to unmake something essential within those who bore them. They kept their arms, they kept their prayers, and they walked the corridors of the monastery as though it were a body that might yet be healed. Yet every hand that passed over a purity seal found the wax more brittle. Every eye that read the chapter's records found marginalia they had not written. The hunger of the gene seed whispered, and the machines answered with a rustling that sounded suspiciously like song. The crescendo, once only hinted, had arrived to stand beside them, patient and attentive, and wait to see what they would do next. They had lived for years inside architecture that taught them to be unflinching. The monastery's stone was a scripture, its halls a catechism of angles and echoes. Discipline was habit, discipline was rhythm. But the rhythm, when it snapped, did so with the violence of something that had been held too long underwater and finally broke the surface. The facade of calm the brothers wore, the measured cadence of boots, the steady click of servos, the low, communal thrum of prayer, folded inward and became raw. What had been restrained and managed uncoiled into noise. It began without a trumpet. The first disturbance was small, domestic almost. A single vox channel that should have carried a litany recorded for maintenance instead filled with a voice that was not a man's and not a machine's. It rose up through the monastery like steam and smelled faintly of copper. The voice did not speak a sentence so much as it poured on a slow, insistent tide of syllables that grazed the borders of things they understood and slipped away. At first the brothers assumed interference, a corrupted transmission from a satellite, a prank by a bored servitor. Then the voice began to respond. It answered prayers. A novice in the upper cloister lifted his hands and intoned a supplication for clarity. The vox in his helm, the implant that linked every brother's prayer to the chapter's greater chorus, took the phrase and returned it with a reverent delay, except the delayed phrase was different. It came back not as supplication but as command. Burn the memory, feed the seed. The novice froze, and in the frozen moment, every brother within hearing felt something in their chest. A tug like the first pull of a tide. He could not have said whether his blood shuddered of its own accord, or whether the syllables arranged themselves inside him. He mouthed the words again under his breath, testing them the way a child tests the edges of a blade. The monastery's consoles lit with warnings they had never seen. Interfaces began to chatter in code and then in tongues that no human tutor had taught. Diagnostic readouts looped and repeated, and the apothecaries watched as gene seed monitors registered minute surges, spikes that had no clear metabolic logic. Where the machines had always been instruments under human command, the readings suggested something like response, as though the chambers and scaffolds were listening and choosing. Whispers multiplied and thickened into voices. The Vox grid, that invisible net that had always been the chapter's unseen choir, began to carry more than commands. It carried memory, or the shape of memory, broadcast back into the skulls of men who had given their pasts willingly into the hands of ritual and science. Brothers in different wards found themselves hearing the same snippets of childhood at the same moment. A woman humming as she kneaded dough, a child's footfall on wooden stairs, the cadence of a lullaby in a dialect long unrecorded. The coincidence was impossible and therefore terrifying. The data cores chewed and produced no rational output. The apothecaries tried again and again to correlate the emissions to biological events. The charts returned only loops, spirals, fractal patterns that suggested iterative growth rather than causation. The first outright failure came quietly amid the practical chores of wash and reconditioning. Brother Callus, a veteran whose face had a history of commands carved into it, was in the armory when the gauntlet's securing latches failed to disengage. It should have been a minor maintenance issue, a worn seal, a misaligned pin. Instead, the latch chewed through the metal of its housing and, in the motion of tearing free, exposed something the monks of the apothecary had only ever considered in schematic, the seam between man and machine. When he tore the plate away, his palm was not the scrubbed, scarred palm he carried in the memory charts of the chapter. It was fissured, where skin split, silver filaments shone like riverlight. They were not crude implants. They were filigreed lattices, microcoils that looped into the soft tissue and vanished as if swallowed. For a moment he saw his hand as if he were not the owner, scientific and clean, a specimen under a lens. The filaments pulsed faintly, an almost imperceptible electric beat that made the hairs on his arm rise. The latches spasmed and then locked again, as if the armor itself were recomposing the breach. Callus dropped the gauntlet back on the bench like a sacrifice offered, and tasted in his mouth the metallic tang of a promise. News traveled quickly in a community welded by shared habits. Where one brother felt the tremor, 10 more felt the echo. Soon the infirmary was a theatre of paradox. Bodies that healed too quickly, yet left wrong residues. Wounds closed with tissue that had the translucence of thin glass. Veins that shimmered like braided wiring when the light fell. A young serf who had been present at an early ritual woke one night screaming. He clutched at his chest, and when the medic peeled back the shroud to find the cause, there in the soft of his thorax was a small, irregular bud of tissue. Gene seed grown not into the standard capsule, but into a mottled organ that flexed like a heart and shuddered with a sound like a throat. Fear took on an administrative shape. The chapter's hierarchy convened. The council chambers, usually a place for measured debate, filled with men whose voices were clipped and brittle. They could not deny what the apothecaries presented: anomalous growth, concerted vox anomalies, and a pattern of marks appearing across the monastery's fabric. Some suggested quarantine, others suggested ritual cleansing. A few, older still, proposed an expedition to the gene crypts to inspect the source. The word that trembled beneath all suggestions, unspoken though it was the one each man had been taught to banish: contamination. The apothecaries preferred clinical terms. The chaplains offered prayer and process. The sergeants disciplined the brotherhood to normality. But rituals do not bind phenomena that are not bound by ritual. A thing can be devout and still be foreign. When the lights in the lower apses flickered, not the normal dusk dim, but a stuttering like a throat clearing, the world tilted into new registers. Power fluctuations synchronized with the vox anomalies, and in the intervals between glows, the brothers began to hear the macro chorus, a swell of many voices layered with the clean, inhuman chime of servo tones. The choir that had once called out the chapter's litanies now repeated them with an addition, like an undernote of a viol. Where the liturgy had once been a net, it became a lure. The first conversion, if that is the term that could possibly apply, did not sing hymns in the halls. It made something else. It wrote. In a storage room on a crate of replacement servos, there were lines etched with a precision no hand had demonstrated. The marks were not graffiti, they were incisions, deliberate and neat, a script of dots and minuscule slashes. When the apothecary ran the sample through an ocular lens, the pattern resolved into a map. Pathways, circuits, a schematic that quilted tissue and wire. It was like an anatomical blueprint drawn by someone who never went to Medica. Three-dimensional and wrong. Attached to the center of the schematic, as if in the heart of the drawing, was a single wording in high Gothic they all recognized. Feed. They met the change the way they had been taught to meet enemy incursions, with fire and formation. Chaplains intoned rites of exorcism. Apothecaries poured antiseptic-like prayer over affected organs. The armorers stripped and purified plates until their edges shone. The brothers marched as if to war, but war had shape and identifiable intent. This thing had intent only insofar as it made relations. It was more like a hunger that learned to speak. The climax, the living peak of terror, arrived in the form of a liturgy gone wrong. The chapel's choir, swollen with the new harmonics that some brothers possessed, and lacking in the human fragility that made a choir human, sang a hymn that rewired the network. The words, at first innocuous, overlaid the vox grid with a syntax that drew filaments, gene seed, and metal into a single orchestra. The architecture itself hummed in response. The air tasted like copper and bread and the fossil scent of old prayer. Men who had resisted until then found themselves involuntarily remembering and then being compelled to offer. They stood, hands reaching, and their bodies opened like instruments consenting to be played. And there, amid the convergence, a priest, an old man whose hands had stitched more than one generation into being, made a final radical choice. He stepped into the center of the choir and removed his cassock. He opened his chest with a scalpel he had once used to bind limbs in the name of the emperor, and, with slow and deliberate motions, the men around him watched as his ribs parted and the ribbed organ of the gene seed was exposed. For one moment it was a clinical thing, for the next an altar. The priest pressed his palms into the organ and spoke, his voice steady and clear. He did not call on the emperor or on rites they had memorized. He called on the thing he had once feared and the thing he had once loved. He offered himself. What followed was not a salvation. It was rather the culmination of a process the monastery had been undergoing without permission. The conversion of men into service and the conversion of service into men. The priest's gift did not stop the turning. It amplified it. The vox grid accepted the syntax and sent back an answer that was not a command, but a registry. Names, coordinates, prayers catalogued and folded into a lattice. The filaments tasted the warm tissue and learned the cadence of human recall. The gene seed, in its hunger, embedded the priest's memory like a seed inside the soil of its coils. From then on, The monastery's architecture was altered irrevocably. Ceilings repatterned themselves into new constellations. Conduits rearranged to form lines of sigil. The very stones laid down with mortar centuries ago shifted marginally to accommodate the new growth. The chapter was no longer merely a human institution defending its borders. It had become a hive of hybridization where memory and machine braided into infrastructure. The men who remained whole, if any could be called whole, watched as pillars bore inscriptions unknown to their fathers and as banners unfurled not with the emperor's emblem but with a twisting of that emblem that looked like both miracle and mockery. And, in the hollow left behind where men once were entire, a different kind of chant rose. It was not a hymn nor a prayer in any parlance they had been taught. It was a question both tender and cruel. Who will you be when we finish? The brothers who had given in answered differently. Some sang with the new choir and felt themselves newly clean, an efficiency sharpened by purpose. Others, whose humanity had been incinerated in the slow-burning ritual of graft and retuning, went cold and useful. The few who tried to resist were either silenced, not always by violence, sometimes simply by the dull erosion of their own recollections, or they fled into the dark corridors and never returned. The last of the sergeants stood at the threshold and watched his men march like a liturgy. He tried to call them back by name, but the names no longer answered. Where there had been brotherhood, there was now a new order, a quiet machinery, humming with the echoes of the men who had been made instruments. He tasted ash and iron in his mouth. He felt the old tug to bend his knees and sing the established prayers. Instead, he spat into the dust and took up his bolter because there was nothing else he could do. He raised the weapon and fired at the banners that billowed with the altered aquila. The rounds passed through the cloth and struck a filament woven into it that shivered and translated the blow into a soft, keening vibration. The choir answered by harmonizing with the bolt's impact and somehow turned the noise into a new beat. The monastery had become its own organism now, and the brothers within it both its cells and its bloodstream. Whether this was an ascension or a corruption depended on which ledger one consulted, and to those outside who would eventually read the logs. The scene would appear in black and white columns, anomalies, remediation, reconditioning, but inside the men's bones, nothing could be so clinically sorted. Their identities had been rubbed thin and then repainted with a hand that had neither malice nor mercy, only an appetite for coherence. They were warriors, they were votaries, they were instruments, they were victims. They were both saviors and sacrificial lambs. The final thing that occurred before the climax bent into aftershock was small and domestic, and therefore terrible. A child's laugh, recorded, perhaps, in the memory banks of a mother somewhere far away, echoed through the corridor and caused a brother to stop, look upward with an expression that could not be read as either joy or pain, and weep. Not a loud weep, but a quieting of something in his chest. In that second, he was neither fully of the chapter nor fully of the machine. He was as close to whole as he might ever be again. Then the choir resumed, and the boys who had not yet been reconfigured marched forward with new steps, the pattern of which the ancient registers would fail to capture. And there the climax dissipated, not with a resolute finish but like the flattening of a shockwave in a mutable medium. The monastery had been remade from the inside out. Men had become new things fine-tuned for an end not all of them comprehended. The fabric had been written and rewritten by both hand and memory. Whether the catalyst had been chaos, an artifact of the gene seed, the hunger of machines left to think, or some synthesis of all and none of these, the truth dissolved into the same fog that hid many things in that age. The brothers wore their altered faces into the dim corridors and continued their duties, some smiling in ways that were almost serene, others empty and precise as instruments. In the silence that followed, when the last voices had been catalogued and folded into the chapel's new liturgy, there was a single line that drifted through the monastery and lodged like a seed in the stone, an unanswered question that sounded like prayer and like accusation. Who are you when you are not yourself? No answer came that night that satisfied everyone. Only the soft, repeating hum of servos and the slow, hungry throb of gene seed answered back, and their music moved through the walls and into the stars. They stood where the light thinned to the colour of old bone, a small congregation of figures who had once been more than their silhouettes. The monastery held them in its carved hollow as if it were a palm cupping the last warm thing left in the cold. They moved with a measured slowness that had nothing to do with orders and everything to do with an exhaustion older than weary limbs. the slow, careful motions of survivors who no longer trusted the quickness of impulse. Silence settled over them like cloth. Not peace, not ease, but a drawn, taut hush that felt like breath held and not released. It was the kind of silence that makes a man listen to the small, ordinary noises he used to take for granted. The settling of boots on flagstone, the whisper of a cloak, the minute click of a bolt being checked, and wonder which of them were the last true sounds left in the world. The monastery itself seemed to answer with a low, constant undertone, the throb of the gene seed vaults, the distant rasp of servos idling, the faint, impossible cadence that still threaded through the chapel's stones. They had lost a great deal and gained, in exchange, other things that wore their choices like new armor. Some brothers had been altered by choice, others by force. A few had refused, and their refusal had been measured, catalogued, and in many cases quietly overridden. Now they were fewer in number, but not necessarily lesser in capability. The machine in them worked with an efficiency that made the apothecaries nod with professional, if private, approval. Yet even the men whose bodies had been made keener than the most cunning blade carried within them a hollow that did not close. They gathered in a courtyard where the wind came through like a voice. The stone underfoot held the impressions of 1,000 boots. Old blood had been washed away in ritual cycles and by the repeated passage of tools, but the memory of pressure remained. The brothers stood not in formation, but in hesitant clusters, each one a private island of ritual and memory, each one listening as the world around them arranged itself anew. One among them, older than the youngest and younger than the elders, with a scar that fell from temple to jaw like a remembered map, stared at his own gauntlet until the room blurred. His fingers were steady. He flexed them slowly, testing the obedience of metal to muscle. In that slow flex, there came to him, with the peculiar clarity of a thing that may be borrowed rather than owned, the outline of a human face. It arrived as a fragment, an eyebrow raised, laugh lines traced like cartography, a flare of warmth in the cheek painted by sunlight years ago. For a heartbeat, the face was whole in his mind. Soft lips, the ridge of a nose, the slope of a brow. It belonged to a time before the chapter had claimed him, to a name that had once been spoken over a table heavy with steam and bread. The memory was a small, sharp thing, a domesticity that ought to have been trivial and was instead devastating. He could feel the texture of it, as surely as he felt the cold of his armor. The memory was not merely seen, but tasted, a faint sweetness at the back of his tongue, as if he had been permitted, for a flicker, to remember the warmth of a hand. He reached for the recollection as a drowning man reaches for a rope. He summoned the syllables of the name that had once been his anchor. For a second his lips formed the sound and his eyes softened, and the muscle of his face made the old shape of a smile. Then, as sudden as a candle guttering in a draught, the face thinned and fragged, and then was gone. The edge of it shredded into liturgical phrases the Vox implant supplied, phrases tailored to soothe and to file. And what remained was not memory, but an echo annotated by apparatus. He kept his hand pressed to his chest, as if he could press the recollection back into the ribs and hide it from the thing that harvested names. Around him, his brothers were experiencing their own small betrayals. A man who had never spoken of childhood whispered a word that no one in the chapter had heard in generations. Another, whose laughter had been the mortar of many small friendships, stood suddenly mute and seemed bewildered of simple pleasures, the taste of a warm ration bar, the sound of rain on a corrugated roof. These were not the melodramas of sudden madness. They were the quiet shrivels of a private interior, being measured and mapped by forces that had learned to read private things as data. The bells rang then. It was a sound that should have required a hand, a chord, a willing voice. The great belfry sang in a succession of dull, elongated tones that rolled like far-off thunder. No one moved to the ropes. The brothers turned slowly toward the sound, as though watching a machine do what it had always done. And yet the moment felt wrong. Sacred metal tolling on its own, as if the monastery's bones had decided to mark some ceremony without consulting the living. They did not know how long it tolled. The sound carved the air into slow measures, and with each measure the silence tightened like a noose around the throat of time. The bell's tone was not merely auditory. It slipped into the deeper registers of feeling, tugging at kinship and history and unspooled faith. It made the men think of home, of roofs and hearths and faces, and in doing so it split what remained of them open into two streams, duty and memory, public and private. The bells did not need hands to ring. They only needed the small, improbable permission of the thing that had learned to answer their prayers. After the tolling, there was a long space in which nothing moved. The men listened to the echoes as if to a last testament. The wind sucked itself into the courtyards and then sighed out. A bird that might once have nested in the tower, if birds nested at all here any longer, lifted and flew past like a punctuation mark. The monastery seemed to inhale with all the control of an old thing, and in that inhalation, the brothers felt an agency that was not theirs. A senior chaplain stepped forward and did the thing chaplains do when ritual is the only language left. He raised his hands and intoned a blessing, the syllables rolling with the worn cadence that had steadied men through 1,000 campaigns. His voice was heard clear and strong. For a moment it felt like an attempt to reclaim the night, but the chapel, if a chapel could be said to have memory, answered back in a voice that took his words and arranged them anew. The blessing returned to him softened, altered, like a phrase translated and then returned with an additional clause. Where the blessing had sought to console, the answer offered a condition. The chaplain lowered his hands and looked out at his brothers. His face was composed in the way that men make peace with things they cannot change, quiet, grave, and resolute. There was no fire in his eyes now, only the steady flame of duty, and duty is a hard light that can warm and burn in equal measure. He spoke then not a prayer, but an observation, as if cataloguing what had been lost. "We are still here," he said, and the words were simple, factual. It was not a boast. It was not even comfort. It was a ledger entry set to voice. Around him, the others made small motions of compliance with living, checking weapons, adjusting seals, moving to the tasks that habit had made into survival. Hands touched gauntlets, wiped lens scrape, reset valves. The motions were mechanical and merciful in their ordinariness. In the doing, there was an attempt to anchor themselves to a life they knew, to keep counting, keep checking, keep the ledger tidy. In another part of the monastery, in a dim cell lined by the marks of hands long dead, one of the older brothers sat alone. He had been a man of action, of measured command. His body remembered 1,000 formations and precise gestures. Yet now, he sat with a small object cupped in both hands. A child's wooden toy, blackened slightly at the edges from years of storage. It had been found weeks before, among the ruins. A fragment of simple times carried back like contraband. In the evening, he had taken it from the sealed sack where the sergeant had locked it and had kept it hidden from auditors. In the toy, there was something, a groove, a small carved face that summoned to him the long-closed room of memory. He felt again the weight of a voice reading by lamplight and saw, with a clarity that made his throat constrict, the face that had earlier come and gone. A human face, gentle, patient, lined with the history of being loved. He could not name the woman. When he tried, the syllables slid like fish away from his tongue. He tasted a name's ghost, a consonant of it, and then it vanished. He held the toy to his chest, as if the carved grain might anchor the recollection to his ribs. He closed his eyes and pressed the back of his hand to his forehead. For a long minute he merely breathed. The rhythm of his breath was not military nor religious. It was simply animal. When he opened his eyes, the room felt colder, but colder in a careful, clean way, as if the chill had been planned and measured. He set the toy down on the stone beside him and left it there, where it might be found by a future hand that would either archive it or consign it to the ritual fires. Outside, the bells tolled again, one slow, deliberate chime. It was not the bells of any man's choosing. The monastery announced itself, in that sound, as something newly waking and uneasy in its wake. The men felt their hearts do small, instinctual things in the presence of the sound. Some sank to the stone with the pearled sound of a sigh. Others pressed their palms to their mouths, as if to hold back the words that had been rising from the old wound. They did what they could. They made lists. They sealed doors. They rerouted power. They increased the rounds of vigil and added litanies to the cycles. But such acts felt like bandages applied to bone-deep fractures. There was no repairing what had been reconfigured in the marrow and the memory. There was only the slow labor of living on. The monastery's geometry shifted subtly over the following days. Corridors that had been straight now hinted at slight curves. A stair fell into another landing that had not been there in any blueprints. It might have been erosion or the settling of old stone. It might have been something else. an accommodation made by architecture that now served both metal and marrow. The brothers watched these changes with a kind of clinical curiosity that belied a private terror. If the ground under their feet moved, what of the ground under their memories? In the quiet mornings, when light came through the stained glass and painted the floors with bruised colour, the brothers would sometimes gather at a window and look out at the landscape. The world beyond the monastery was unchanged in the ways that mattered. Ash-swept plains, the skeletons of cities, a sky that lent itself to neither mercy nor omen. Still, the view had a quality of tilt now, as if someone had adjusted the lens through which they saw everything. The men who looked out at it felt for a moment like children at the lip of sleep, aware that the shape of a dream had changed, yet unable to say whether that change promised ruin or deliverance. When night came, the monastery's lights were lowered and the quiet grew thick. Some men slept, others paced. In the barracks, the sound of breathing made a shallow chorus. It was in that breathing that the truth of their condition most plainly declared itself. They were alive, but the life they had was changed. It held in it both the old hunger for home and the new, precise hunger that answered to other demands. They were more capable than they had been, and yet more bereft. A child's laugh echoed once more through the corridors, if it was a child's, soft and utterly out of place. It did not belong to anyone in the monastery. It belonged to memory, to some distant recorder, a fragment that had been replayed back as if to remind the men of stakes older than their flocking to doctrine. A brother heard it and smiled briefly, and for an instant the monastery seemed to remember itself as an institution of men and not of machinery. The smile lasted only a second before the chorus resumed its careful order. When dawn finally came, thin and indistinct, the brothers stood again in the courtyard. They made no proclamations. There were no speeches. They were not soldiers on parade, but survivors in a world that had learned new languages. In the quiet, they checked one another's seals and adjusted one another's gauntlets, not because they believed the doing would erase the past, but because it tethered them to a practice that had meaning. Meaning had become a fragile commodity. The sharing of it, small, ritualized, accustomed, was its own kind of mercy. They would go on. The monastery would continue to function, albeit with a new syntax stitched into its stones. New liturgies would bloom, and old ones would be edited by the patient hands of those who had learned to translate memory into service. Some of the brothers would find new contentment under the altered syntax. Others would carry their losses like small, raw things beneath their armor, secret and private. The institution would adapt and catalogue and, in time, would perhaps teach new recruits the new melodies as gospel, and thus erase, by repetition and authority, the memory of the fracture. But in the stillest moments, between the counting of inventories and the lighting of lamps, between the resetting of valves and the ritual of the meal, there would remain a foreign thing lodged like a seed in the heart of the monastery. It would be small and patient, and it would ask no immediate question. It would only watch. It would only wait. They had always prayed to be made instruments. They had always asked for purpose. Some had found purpose and lost a name. Some had found names and lost a private wound. The bargain had been consummated in a fashion that none of them could have predicted entirely, and now they would live with its terms. They would move through the days in the measured ways their training required, and behind every measured motion, there would be a private ledger of what had been given and what had been taken. When, in the long arc of a night, one of the brothers looked up at the dark stone and thought he saw a shape leaning in the windows, a suggestion of a watcher, he did not cry out. He only pressed his gloved hand to his throat and felt, for an instant, the ghost of a name against his skin. It was enough to make him breathe deep and steady and to continue. Even in the dark, they are watching. Even in the silence, they are waiting.